The guns of World War II have their way with the restructuring of society, including education. 1944, this was the so-called golden age of women school administrators. In this period, from 1919 to 1950, women held around 25% of county superintendencies. Now note this in contrast with the pre-World War statistics, where they held only 10% of all superintendencies. However, the GI Bill for veterans in 1944, when millions of returning veterans returned home looking for their jobs, we see a significant restructuring, reaffirming masculine identification with leadership. Men wanting their roles as principals and superintendents returned to them. School boards began to look for decidedly masculine traits among masculine applicants, and this also counteracted a widespread fear that homosexuals would occupy educational leadership positions. According to one researcher, Blount's work, the female superintendency was at 718 in 1950. That number dropped to 366 20 years later in 1970. Other kinds of diversity we see in this time. 1945, the baby boomer school enrollment increased by 2/3. There was great diversity of students and led to a push toward diversification of curriculum and different kinds of program offerings. 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education. During this time, principals were the leaders of integration in their schools. The success of desegregation rested heavily on leadership as change agents within the school. 1957, the launch of Sputnik. Americans realized that they were behind the space program as what they called the space race. This prompted federal funding for a gifted education, which included substantial funding in leadership training, and administrators were charged with leading their schools in math and science education, as well as in the development of gifted education programs. This era is key to understand that the Common School movement did not necessarily produce common education for all in a democratic way. Greater diversity, because of war or because of economic development, may not always equal democracy. World War II created a race of arms, a race to space, and also created a war of ideals. Capitalism and democracy, or communism, socialism. Slavery and racism especially gained greater international attention, according to one researcher, Emery. It became an embarrassment to American government leaders. In 1965, Elementary and the Secondary Education Act and the American Indian Education Act both gave more control to local schools. There was a hope that funding would reach more students and that a greater variety of programs might be offered. In this era, unions and activist groups set a trend for their involvement to shape educational policy and practice that we still see today. Groups stood up for equal racial and gender rights. Demonstrators spoke out against the Vietnam War. The 1966 Coleman Report, formerly known as Equality of Educational Opportunity, challenged an historical view that school resources were the primary variables of student success. Instead, the report put forward that socioeconomic standing instead and upbringing were the greatest factors. In an educational leadership article published in 1980, writers Tamar and Guthrie comment on this, quote, me generation, unquote, of the 1970s. This is a group that they were either weary of the reforms of the 1950s and 60s, or they had a desire to consolidate them. These writers note that the following decade, leading us into the 80s, would be characterized for a need of efficiency and scaling down of spending. That leads us to the next section, the 1980s to the present.